Hi there, I'm John McAdams, founder of the Big Game Hunting blog. In this video, we're going to talk about everything 9.3 millimeter and 375 caliber. Specifically, I discuss the most popular 9.3 millimeter and 375 caliber CIP and or SAAMI certified cartridges and discuss their history, legacy, their strengths and weaknesses, and their recommended uses in detail. Now, most of these cartridges are very popular for hunting Africa, but as you will learn here shortly, that's not the case with all of them. Indeed, a couple are uniquely American or European hunting cartridges, and a couple aren't even hunting cartridges at all. Before we get started, make sure you are on my email list. To do that, click the link in the video description or go to huntingguns101.com and sign up there for my free ebook on the best hunting cartridges. You'll get my free ebook when you do that, plus you'll also start to receive the emails I send out every weekday. These are entertaining and informative emails about hunting, shooting, ballistics, things like that. I get feedback all the time from people telling me how much they look forward to hearing from me every day. So make sure you're getting those emails too by clicking the link in the video description or by going to huntingguns101.com. I also put links below the video in the description to articles I've written about some of these cartridges I talk about in the video, as well as some of my favorite pieces of hunting gear like slings, ear protection, scopes, things like that. So don't forget to check that stuff out. And also, one last thing, be sure you subscribe to my channel and like this video. Just hit that red subscribe button below the video and you'll start to get my new videos when I release them. Okay, let's get started talking about 9.3 millimeter and 375 caliber cartridges.
I'll run this episode sort of like a reloading manual. We'll work in ascending order by caliber and then in ascending order by power within each caliber. So the first one up is the 9.3 by 72R. This is kind of a weird cartridge, and you may recall back in episode, I think it was 206, Kevin Roberts and I were talking about classic safari hunting cartridges, and we were working through all of the different cartridges, and I asked him about the 9.3 by 72R, and he said, well, John, I think you mean the 9.3 by 74R. And I confused him with the question, and he confused me a little bit by the response. And I went back through my notes, and I realized that there actually was a 9.3 by 72R. I wasn't mistaken, but at the same time, Kevin was also not mistaken either, because the 74R, we'll talk about that one in a minute, is definitely the much more popular. But we'll start with this one. Like I said, this is a really weird cartridge. And if you look at it, and I have a picture posted on Instagram of that cartridge with all the other ones in this episode, it is a very, very long, skinny, tapered, rimmed cartridge. Before diving into the details of the 9.3 by 72R, I want to give you a little bit of background information that will help understand the purpose of this cartridge, along with a couple of the other ones we'll also discuss in this episode. Firearms development in Europe went down a slightly different track than firearms development did in the United States. Over here, we went from muzzle loaders to breech loading single-shot rifles, as well as lever-action breech loaders, and then on to bolt actions later. Europeans skipped the lever action step, really. Lever actions weren't really popular in Europe. That is much more of a North American and specifically American development. But they kind of skipped that step and they went to breech loading single-shot and multi-barreled rifles before reaching that bolt action stage of development, similar to how we did here. Now, some of those break action rifles were double-barreled, like the double rifle still popular in Africa today. Others were so-called combination guns. There was no real standard for what a combination gun was. There were lots of different options. So there's a thing called a drilling, for drei or three in German, and that is a three-barreled gun. Sometimes you got two shotgun barrels and one centerfire rifle barrel. Sometimes you had a single shotgun barrel, a bigger bore rifle barrel, and sometimes a smaller caliber centerfire or even a rimfire barrel. Sometimes they even had what were referred to as Vierlings for Vier or four in German, which had four barrels. Any way you slice it, these combination guns were and are very flexible firearms, and between the various shotgun, rimfire, and centerfire barrels, a hunter could use a single gun to take basically any species of game from birds and small game up through the various species of deer, starting with roe deer, then of course you had fallow deer, wild boar, red stag, even brown bear, and moose with a single firearm. Now, even though they are an older design, there are lots of single and double-barreled rifles still in circulation, and the same is also true with combination guns. Some places even still manufacture them. Now, European combination guns are often beautiful works of art. Sometimes they're custom made, often they're very expensive. But even to this day, combination guns of various types are still relatively popular. I wouldn't say they're as popular as a bolt action rifle or anything like that, but there's still a lot of people that use rifles like this. Because remember, even though they can be expensive, a good combination gun can fill the role of 2, 3, or even 4 other firearms, depending on the exact configuration we're talking about. Well, rimmed cartridges are most popular with these types of guns. That's not a hard and fast rule. There are exceptions. But just like with lever action guns and single shot rifles, most break action firearms of any kind, be they shotguns or rifles, single, double, triple, or even quadruple barrel guns, mostly use rimmed cartridges for head spacing. This brings us back to the 9.3 by 72R. This is a rimmed cartridge that was commonly used in combination guns a long, long time ago, primarily in Germany. Now, the 9.3 by 72R is far from the only rimmed cartridge that fits in this niche today either, and we will come back to this point a couple more times over the course of this episode with several other cartridges. But the 9.3 by 72 is most likely the oldest cartridge that I'm going to talk about in this episode, and it's also the lowest power, and it also uses the smallest diameter bullets. That's why we're talking about it first. Now, going back to the thing with Kevin Robertson that I mentioned earlier, I had this cartridge in my mind that it was a thing because I thought I knew a guy that had a rifle that had one. After that podcast episode with Kevin, I went back and verified that was indeed the case. Guy I know pretty well owned a combination gun that had one 16-gauge shotgun barrel and one 9.3 by 72R rifle barrel. We called it a drilling, but that's not technically an accurate description of this gun because it only had 2 barrels. But it was still a combination gun that was still built along the same lines of a lot of guns made in this cartridge. It was a break-action firearm that had both shotgun and rifled barrels. Beautiful work of art. Really nice looking engraving on it. Just a great looking rifle. So I wasn't crazy for asking him about that cartridge in that episode, and Kevin also wasn't crazy for trying to move on to the 9.3 by 74R because the 9.3 by 72R was not used in Africa very much at all. This is because this particular cartridge has really fallen by the wayside for a number of reasons. And for one thing, the cartridge is pretty underpowered. It probably started out originally as a black powder round, sort of like the 4570, so it was loaded to a relatively low pressure. S&B is the only ammo company I'm aware of that makes factory-loaded 9.3 by 72R ammunition right now. They make one factory load shooting a 193 grain bullet at 2,005 feet per second for 1,722 foot-pounds of energy. For reference, that is less energy than a 243, a 6.5 Creedmoor, or a 30-30. You can certainly kill stuff with it, and lots of people certainly used to, but there's also a reason why hunters have moved on to other higher-performing rounds. And oh, by the way, it uses a weird bullet diameter, too. Every other 9.3 millimeter cartridge in common use, to include all of the other ones I'm going to talk about in this episode, use .366 caliber bullets. For some reason, the 9.3 by 72R uses .364 caliber bullets. So it's even a challenging proposition for hand loaders who may have a rifle in this chambering that they just want to roll their own ammunition for. You can find bullets out there for it, you could find factory ammo out there for it, but it's just really hard. All in all, the 9.3 by 72 is a cool cartridge for those who want an older rifle cartridge with a lot of history, and especially when combined with some of the more beautiful rifles that were previously made in that cartridge that are still, floating around out there and you could find on the used market from time to time. Okay, next, let's move up a little bit to the 9.3 by 57 millimeter Mauser. This is basically an 8 millimeter Mauser or an 8 by 57 millimeter cartridge necked up to shoot .366 caliber bullets. Originally released around 1900, there were some Mauser and Mannlicher rifles manufactured for it. Norma makes a factory load for it right now with a 232 grain Oryx at 2,362 feet per second for about 2875 foot-pounds of energy. That's more or less comparable to the 30-06, just with a heavier and larger diameter bullet going a little bit slower. Used to be somewhat popular in Scandinavia for hunting game like moose and deer. I've heard that some people jokingly refer to it as the potato or the spud gun, making fun of the large, slow bullet that it shoots. When I was a teenager, my dad had a Husqvarna rifle in this chambering. So yeah, they make guns too, not just chainsaws and lawnmowers. As far as I know, that was the only company that made rifles in that chambering in large numbers. I don't think they make new production rifles in 9.3 by 57 anymore, but if you look hard enough on the secondary market, you can find rifles out there for them. And like I said, Norma also makes factory ammo for that cartridge right now too. I think this cartridge was something of a remnant of a time, kind of like we experienced here in the United States in the early to mid 20th century, where you only had a couple of rifle cartridges that were really popular. And so there were a lot of spin offs of those cartridges, like you got with the 338-06 and the 8mm-06 and the 270 and the 25-06 and whatnot. Here, a lot of people did similar things with the 7mm and 8mm Mauser cartridges in Europe. And now that there are a lots more other options, cartridges like that have fallen by the wayside a little bit. All right, next, let's talk about the 9.3 by 62. This is perhaps my favorite cartridge. Well, it's between the 9.3 and the 300 Win Mag. To this point, I think I've probably killed more game with my 9.3 than I have with any other chamber. But the 9.3 comes out on top in terms of the mass of all the animals I've shot with it combined. I killed a couple deer, a couple hogs, an impala, a black bear, a zebra, a Cape buffalo, and even an elephant, yes, an elephant, with my 9.3 by 62. Designed in 1905 by a man named Otto Bach, the 9.3 by 62, like all the other 9.3 millimeter cartridges except the 9.3 by 72, shoots .366 caliber bullets. This cartridge gives performance almost on par with the 375 H&H, but it does so out of a standard length bolt-action rifle, and it has less recoil to boot. This cartridge actually came along before the 375 H&H, and it was right at the cutting edge of rifle development in the early 1900s, where gun companies were starting to switch to bolt-action rifles loaded with smokeless powder. In fact, you could even describe the 375 H&H as a British response to the German 9.3 cartridge, because this German cartridge became very popular very quickly, especially in Africa. Now, this cartridge fits right into that same niche as other cartridges like this 7x57mm Mauser that is enough in the right areas without being too much in the wrong ones. This is an extremely versatile cartridge, and it will work great for a lot of the hunting that most people want to do. Like I mentioned earlier, it is especially popular in Africa. That is where it really got its start and it made its bones, especially among German settlers in modern-day Tanzania and Namibia. In fact, I've told the story in the podcast previously in episode 267, which was a profile of the 9.3 by 62 millimeter cartridge. My cousin has a CZ550 in that chambering. He took it on a plains game hunt to Namibia many years ago. And he hunted everything, say, from springbok and warthog on the smaller end up through kudu on the big end. So a pretty large spectrum of game. He was using very basic 285 or 286 grain soft point bullets. Ranges were, call it 50 to 200 yards for most of this stuff, so not very far shooting, but it was very impressive how this cartridge worked for him over there. It was great. His PH loved it, and he was joking at the end of the hunt, "Brian, I love this 9.3. It's like a laser. Boom. Everything you shoot with it just goes straight down. It's great." Kevin Robertson also talked about a Bruno rifle he owned, chambered in 9.3 by 62 in his book, Africa's Most Dangerous. And at one point in that book, on page 100 and 101, he recounts what the previous owner of that rifle told him as far as guidance was when Kevin bought that rifle. This old man that he bought it from was a very experienced crop protection hunter that had killed hundreds of buffalo over the course of his career, all using that rifle. So this is what he had to say. "Learn to shoot the Bruno well, especially offhand. Also, get to know a buffalo's internal anatomy intimately from all angles, for if you hit one in exactly the right spot with a good 9.3 bullet, it will not go far. Never take any moving or poorly positioned going away shots. Be sure to get in really close before you pull the trigger. The 375 H&H will often shoot a solid right through one buffalo and then wound another. Be especially careful to remember this when hunting thick brush or in herds, because it will be the one you have unknowingly wounded which will kill you. With the 9.3, this usually does not happen, and that is why I preferred it to the 375 H&H. Follow this advice, my boy, and the rifle will not let you down. That paragraph sums up most of the strengths and weaknesses of the 9.3 very well. First, it's a stone cold killer that performs much better than you would think just by looking at its performance on paper. Plus, it's also a cartridge that works in a velocity range where it delivers ideal performance, and you don't necessarily need a premium bullet to get that performance. I'm sure this old guy that sold Kevin the rifle was using very basic soft points or maybe solids in the rifle. I'll bet you a lot of money this old man wasn't using Barnes or A-frame bullets or any of that stuff. He was getting great results from being very careful, placing his shots properly, and it was all doing that, like I said, with very basic 285, 286 grain soft points, probably. Let's also be honest here, too. The 9.3 is adequate for dangerous game. I don't mean that as a slur, but let's also not get carried away either. It will work darn well, but remember what the old man said. Get in close, don't take any moving or risky shots, wait for the perfect shot angle, place your shot with care. If you do that, the buff is going to run 50 to 100 yards and then die. I personally think this cartridge is wonderful for everything short of thick-skinned dangerous game. And like I said, it is adequate for that sort of game. I would not describe it as great for that sort of game. And plus, there's also that old British rule on a .375 caliber minimum in many places in Africa for hunting thick-skinned dangerous game. Some countries specifically allow 9.3 millimeter cartridges, like Zimbabwe, so sometimes it's legal for dangerous game, sometimes it's not. That is why sometimes you hear the 9.3 by 62 referred to as the quote-unquote minimum cartridge for hunting dangerous game in Africa. Hornady currently makes a couple factory loads for the cartridge, one of which is a 286 grain interlock at 2,360 feet per second for about 3,500 foot-pounds of energy. Federal makes a 286 grain A-frame or a Woodley Hydro Solid, both at also 2360, also for 36 foot-pounds of energy. Nosler and Swift also make factory loads for the cartridge with lighter 250 or 260 grain bullets. Barnes makes 250 and 286 grain TSX and banded solid component bullets for handloaders to use in .366 caliber. Swift offers their breakaway solid and A-frame bullets both as component bullets for handloaders and in loaded ammunition for the 9.3 by 62 as well. S&B also makes a 286 grain soft point at 2280 feet per second for about 3,300 foot-pounds of energy. Norma makes 11 loads for the cartridge. RWS makes 9 different loads for it. So there's some ammo available for the 9.3 from American companies, and there is a lot of ammo available from European companies. Right now, Tikka and Sako both make rifles for the 9.3 by 62. Of course, Mauser still does, so does Sauer, so are probably other companies that I didn't mention in Europe. At one point, Ruger, CZ, and Winchester all built 9.3 by 62 rifles as well, though as far as I know, none of those companies do at this instant, but enough of them were made, you don't have to look very hard on the secondary market to find used rifles in this chambering in good condition. The 9.3 by 62 remains pretty popular to this day. It's not even close to being on par with something like a 30-06, but the 9.3 by 62 might be the number 2 most popular cartridge I discuss in this podcast and is second only to the 375 H&H in that regard. All in all, I think this is an outstanding all-around hunting cartridge. You could make a great argument that this is the ideal cartridge for someone who wants a single, extremely versatile rifle cartridge for hunting the widest possible variety of game. Okay, next, let's talk about the 9.3 by 74R. This is the rimmed version of the 9.3 by 62. Now, I say that, but realize it is not directly related to the 9.3 by 62, and it is actually a couple years older than the 9.3 by 62. The 9.3 by 74R was released in 1900, while the 62 was released in 1905. The 74R is loaded to a slightly lower pressure, 49,000 psi versus 56,500 for the 62, but it is also a slightly larger cartridge. The end result is that the cartridges have basically identical ballistics. Everything you can do with the 9.3 by 62, you can do with the 9.3 by 74R. Since it is a rimmed cartridge, it is most often used in single-shot and double-barreled rifles, along with the various combination guns I told you about earlier in this podcast. This cartridge remains quite popular in Europe. Lots of European combination guns or double rifles. You can get them from Dumoulin, Chapuis, Merkel, Beretta, Heim. All of those are doubles. You can get a Blaser K95 single shot. Ruger made the #1 rifle in this chambering for a little while. There's a couple of different factory loads available for it. Nosler makes a loading with a 250 grain AccuBond at 2,550 feet per second, which gives you just over 3,600 foot-pounds of energy. They also make a 250 grain E-tip loading at 2,425 feet per second for about 3,200 foot-pounds of energy. Hornady also makes a factory load for this cartridge, 286 grain interlock at 2,360 feet per second for just over 3,500 foot-pounds of energy. Exact same ballistics as the 9.3 by 62 loading from Hornady I mentioned a minute ago. Federal also makes it with the exact same loading that they have for the 9.3 by 62 with that 286 grain A-frame or the Woodley Hydro Solid. S&B makes a 286 grain soft point at 2,312 feet per second for about 3,400 foot-pounds of energy. That's a those are all pretty standard loads for the cartridge. RWS makes ammo for the 9.3 by 74 as well. They got 6 different loads to be exact. Bullets range from the 183 grain Evo Green, which is a lead-free bullet, up to a 293 grain Uni Classic. That's one of their tougher and better penetrating bullets. Norma makes ammo with bullets ranging from their 232 grain Vulcan, 250 grain Eco Strike, 285 grain Oryx, and Alaska bullets for this cartridge too. Now, a podcast listener named Steve, I correspond with frequently, has a Heim over-under in 9.3 by 74. He's a big fan of that rifle. He has used that rifle extensively in Texas and also used a Merkel double in the same cartridge to take 2 scrub bulls in Australia a few years ago. So, like I said, everything you can do with the 9.3 by 62, you could do with the 9.3 by 74R, just usually in a break action rifle of some sort, be that a traditional side-by-side double, an over-under, or a combination gun. All right, let's move things up a little bit more to the 9.3 by 64 millimeter Brenneke. Now, Wilhelm Brenneke developed a variety of new rifle cartridges, bullets, and even shotgun slugs. Have you ever heard of a Brenneke shotgun slug? Well, he was the guy that designed it. He also designed his own version of a drilling combination gun. However, the 7 by 64 and the 9.3 by 64 Brenneke rifle cartridges are 2 of his better-known inventions, and the 9.3 by 64 is the largest and most powerful cartridge he ever designed. Released in 1927, the 9.3 by 64 is one of the most powerful 9.3 millimeter cartridges in existence, and it uses a design that squeezes basically all the performance you can get from a standard Mauser rifle. The case is not only pretty long at 64 millimeters. For reference, a 30-06 is 63 millimeters long. The case of it is 63 millimeters long. But this case is also larger in diameter, and it has a 0.496-inch rim diameter and a 0.507-inch base diameter. For those reasons, this isn't just a simple plug-and-play proposition with a standard Mauser rifle, and a gunsmith will, in addition to putting a new barrel on the rifle, will also need to make some adjustments to the rifle for the cartridge to fit and function appropriately. So basically with this cartridge, you are indeed getting 375 H&H Magnum performance, or even a little bit more sometimes, depending on the exact load, but out of a standard Mauser rifle. Now, like I mentioned earlier, the 9.3 by 62 millimeter gets you most of the way there. The 9.3 by 64 gets you the rest of the way there, plus a little bit extra over the old 375. But it's just a little bit more tricky to get set up than the smaller 9.3. John Taylor had this to say about the 9.3 by 64 in his book, African Rifles and Cartridges. My friend, the German hunter, to whom I frequently refer, used one of these rifles fitted with a Zeiss scope and killed most of his elephant with it. It is strongly recommended if you can get shells for it, but it may be that this cartridge will not be loaded again. Those are prophetic words because that's really the case today. Ammo is scarce for the 9.3 by 64. RWS makes 2 factory loads for it right now. One is a 183 grain Evolution Green at 3,182 feet per second, and a 293 grain Uniclassic at 2,509 feet per second for almost 4,100 foot-pounds of energy. So you compare that performance to a 375 H&H, 300 grain bullet at 2,500 to 2,550 feet per second. The 375 does give you a tiny bit more muzzle energy and a little bit larger diameter bullet, but that 9.3 millimeter bullet is a higher sectional density projectile, 0.312 sectional density versus 0.305 sectional density for the 375 here. The 9.3 also gives you a little bit less recoil, and once again, it can be used in a standard length Mauser rifle without bumping up to that larger Magnum length rifle that the 375 requires. The Russians also allegedly developed an armor-piercing bullet for the 9.3 by 64, and they chambered some of their SVD sniper rifles in this larger caliber for anti-materiel use and for use against targets wearing body armor. Interesting use of the cartridge there. As far as for hunting and whatnot goes, like I said, it's going to do everything that the 9.3 by 62 does, and it's plus a little bit more, but it's just a little bit more of a pain to work with than the 9.3 by 62. And combined with the relative scarcity of rifles and ammo for the cartridge now, the juice just may not be worth the squeeze for someone that was looking for a dangerous game rifle. I would say either bump down to the 9.3 by 62 or the 9.3 by 74R, or go up to one of the 375s that we'll talk about here in a minute. All right, next let's talk about the 370 Sako, or the 9.3 by 66. Introduced in 2002 by Sako, the 370 Sako is basically a 30-06 lengthened by 3 millimeters and necked up to 9.3 millimeter or .366 caliber. Then they renamed the cartridge from a metric to an imperial caliber to appeal to Americans. Compared to the 9.3 by 62, the 370 Sako has the shoulder a little bit farther forward and is a little bit longer overall. The 9.3 by 62 actually has a maximum overall length of 3.29 inches, while the 370 Sako has a maximum length of 3.34 inches, and it utilizes all the space available in a standard length rifle action. It's also loaded to a little bit higher pressure, 57,500 for the 9.3 by 62 versus 60,000 psi for the 370 Sako. End result, it's a little bit more powerful. There is a federal loading with a 286 grain A-frame at 2,550 feet per second for just over 4,100 foot-pounds of energy. They have a very similar but a little bit slower loading with a 286 grain Woodley Hydro Solid. Good all-around cartridge, trajectory very similar to a 30-06, but it hits with very nearly the power of a 375 H&H, and it's available in a standard length bolt-action rifle. Plus, you get one more round in the magazine compared to a 375 because it uses a more narrow case. Once again, a good idea, but I guess just most people didn't think the juice was worth the squeeze, and it seems to be a dying cartridge. Sako made it in their Sako Model 85 rifle for a while. I don't think anything is in current production for this chambering. I found 0 used rifles for sale in this chambering on Gunbroker for what it's worth. Sort of like the 9.3 by 64, the 370 Sako just might be in that window where it may be easier for someone to get a 9.3 by 62 or just bump up to the 375 H&H or one of the other 375s. Speaking of 375s, let's bump on up to 375 caliber. We'll start with the 3855 Winchester, also known as the 3855 Ballard. This cartridge was introduced in 1884 by Marlin for the Ballard rifle. This was originally a black powder round, and it used the black powder naming convention of a 38 caliber bullet propelled by 55 grains of black powder. That's where the name 3855 came from. And of course, the cartridge, since it's still around, has transitioned over to smokeless powder. There's a couple different bullet sizes that can be used in this. Depends on the exact rifle that we're talking about, though. Some are a true 375 caliber, some 377 caliber, some 378 caliber, some even as big as 382 caliber. But like I said, depends on the rifle. Winchester also picked up this cartridge, offered it in their 1894 lever action rifle. Marlin also offered it in their 336 for a while. Winchester currently makes one factory offering for it, 255 grain power point at 1,320 feet per second for 987 foot-pounds of energy. HSM also makes a factory load for the 3855. In this case, it's a 240 grain lead bullet at 1,325 feet per second for 936 foot-pounds of energy. These are all very sedate loadings, not very powerful. You could use for deer, but probably not much bigger than that, and it also has a pretty limited range. And remember, it's below 1,000 foot-pounds of energy when it leaves the muzzle. And since these cartridges are designed for use in a lever-action rifle with a tubular magazine, the bullets aren't very aerodynamic either. Some people have hunted with the cartridge over the years, but really where it has seen the most use is in the target shooting realm. A lot of stuff in cowboy action shooting and black powder silhouette shooting. In addition to that stuff, though, probably the biggest legacy of the cartridge is the fact that it is the parent to the 3030 Winchester cartridge. Okay, let's keep going. We'll talk about the 375 Winchester. This cartridge was developed in 1938 for the Model 94 big bore lever gun, and that's basically a strengthened version of the old 1894 lever gun. Ruger also offered it in the number 3 rifle. Savage offered it in their 99 lever action rifle as well. The 375 Winchester is actually descended from the 3855 Winchester, and it basically uses a shortened and modified 3855 case, but it is a much higher pressure load. Winchester makes a 200 grain power point loading for the cartridge at 2,200 feet per second, so going a lot faster and has a lot more energy, about 2,150 foot-pounds of muzzle energy. This cartridge is more or less comparable to the 35 Remington, which is a 200 grain bullet at 2,080 feet per second for 1,921 foot-pounds of energy. Hornady also makes 35 Remington ammo in their Lever Evolution line. In this case, it's a 200 grain bullet at 2,225 feet per second for nearly 2,200 foot-pounds of energy. So like I said, 35 Remington and 375 Winchester, pretty comparable in power, but both are quite a bit more powerful than the old 3855. Make darn sure that you do not shoot 375 Winchester in a 3855 rifle. Since they use the same case, and since the 375 Winchester is actually shorter, it is possible to chamber it in one of those rifles, so be very, very careful. But as you will learn here in a second, the 375 Winchester is quite a bit less powerful than all the other 375 cartridges we're going to talk about in this episode, to include the old 375 H&H. I have a good friend that I hunted with a lot up in Washington. He had a Winchester big bore 94 in 375 Winchester he used for hunting black bear, black-tailed deer, even elk where we lived up in Washington. And he and I were talking about Africa one day, and I mentioned offhand that a lot of places you need a 375 to hunt Cape buffalo. And he's like, I got that covered. I got a 375 Winchester. I said, that is not the same as the 375 H&H, and it is actually quite a bit less powerful. So even though you may be meeting a minimum caliber limit by using a 375 Winchester, you're going to come nowhere close to the recommended or the legally required minimum energy for hunting thick-skinned dangerous game over there. Even so, the cartridge is a great short-range heavy hitter. Use it for deer, bear, hogs, even moose at close range if you're feeling frisky. You can throw elk in there too if you can get a shorter range shot on one of them. Next, let's talk about the 376 Steyr. This was designed as a partnership between Hornady and Steyr in 2000 to fulfill Jeff Cooper's scout rifle concept. I need to define two concepts for you here. One is what Jeff Cooper called the general purpose rifle. He talked about this in his book, Art of the Rifle. The general purpose rifle will do equally well for all but specialized hunting as well as for fighting. Thus, it must be powerful enough to kill any living target of reasonable size. If you insist upon a definition of reasonable size, let us introduce an arbitrary mass figure of about 1,000 pounds. So that is your general purpose rifle. Now, what the heck is a scout rifle? Once again, this is a term that Jeff Cooper invented. A scout rifle is basically a bolt-action rifle. Overall length 39 inches or shorter, barrel length 19 inches or shorter, weighing less than 7 pounds, have both iron and optical sights. You can fit it with a practical sling for shooting and for carrying, and capable of reliably hitting man-sized targets out to about 500 yards. Now, Steyr originally produced a rifle they called the Steyr Scout back in 1998 in .308 Winchester that checks basically all of those boxes. They also made another version of this rifle in .350 Remington Magnum that Cooper called the Lion Scout rifle. They also produced another very similar rifle in a new cartridge we now refer to as the .376 Steyr for game bigger than that 1,000-pound cutoff I just mentioned. Cooper called this rifle the Dragoon or the Dragoon Scout, but few other people did, and neither did the folks at Steyr. Some of you will get this reference. He kept trying to make fetch happen with the Dragoon, but it just wasn't going to happen. Now, to fit within Cooper's specified size constraints, the .376 Steyr was a little shorter overall, just 3.11 inches. Compare that to 3.34 inches for, say, a 30-06. So this cartridge fit in between the so-called short action and standard length action cartridge lengths I often referred to in the show. Now, despite the name, this cartridge shoots a .375 caliber bullet, and it very nearly duplicates the performance of the .375 H&H. With that short overall length, it uses a fatter case with a base diameter of 0.5 inches, and it's loaded to a little bit higher pressure of 62,366 psi. Hornady makes a couple factory loadings for it. One of them is a 225 grain interlock at 2,600 feet per second for almost 3,400 foot-pounds of energy. They also make a load with a 270 grain interlock, also at 2,600 feet per second for just over 4,000 foot-pounds of energy. Now, this rifle and this cartridge had a lot of buzz surrounding them initially due to its association with Jeff Cooper. Now, I've never shot this cartridge myself, but recoil has been described as significant. That is not surprising, though, considering that you are shooting a cartridge very nearly on par with the .375 H&H out of an 8-pound rifle. 10 pounds is much more common with the .375. This is an interesting concept where a hunter could have a single, relatively compact and easy-to-carry rifle that's capable of taking literally every species of big game in the world, from deer up to elephant. I really like the overall scout rifle concept, though, but that is probably better suited to a .308 than to a .375 caliber dangerous game cartridge. Once again, fits into that more general purpose rifle definition as opposed to the more specialized rifle cartridge that you would need for something like Cape Buffalo. Now, anyone who's familiar with Jeff Cooper knows that he was the very definition of old school. He was a product of the time that he grew up in, where guns were made out of metal and wood. Good handgun cartridges had calibers that start with a 4, like the .45 ACP and the 10mm auto, which he helped design. He also kind of poo-pooed those who struggled with recoil, and at least from his writings, it seemed like his advice for those who struggled with recoil was just to suck it up and deal with it. Now, we'll talk more about this in a minute, but the .375 H&H has recoil in, say, a 10-ish pound rifle that is near the top of what the average person can handle. The fact also remains, though, that you take .375 H&H power in a 10-pound rifle, that's one thing, but you take that same amount of performance and put it in an 8-pound rifle, it's going to be a lot more for everybody to handle. No need to email me saying that you handle recoil great or that your 16-year-old daughter handles that recoil great. I believe you. Good for you. That doesn't change the fact that it's hard for a lot of people. And now you take that fact, combined with some of the quality control issue that some of these rifles had, especially when they first came out, and there's a lot of problems floating around all of a sudden. Now, the .376 Steyr came out near the end of Cooper's life. They released it in 2000. He died in 2006. I'm sure that they made sure that the particular rifle they sent him was perfect, and he went out of his way to say so at every opportunity, how much he loved this rifle, etc. But not everyone had the same experience. This is not the only story I have heard about quality control issues with this rifle in this chambering, but I have it on good authority that there was one guy in particular getting ready to go on a Cape Buffalo hunt in Africa, and his barrel shot off his rifle at the range. That does not inspire confidence in quality control of a rifle when something like that happens. So you talk about that, and then you talk about the recoil. That's one of the reasons why, as good as this concept may have been in theory, it just never really received widespread adoption. I will say that the Steyr Scout Rifle itself is still around, and it seems to be doing pretty well in smaller caliber offerings. Steyr still manufactures it in 223, 243, 6.5 Creedmoor, and 7mm 08, in addition to the 308 Winchester cartridge they originally released it in. Something tells me that Cooper rolled over in his grave when Steyr introduced that rifle in 6.5 Creedmoor, though. So, all things considered, the 376 seems to be basically another dead cartridge. Hornady does still make ammo for it, but I don't even think Steyr makes their Scout Rifle in that cartridge anymore. Okay, let's talk about the 375 Holland Holland Magnum. I've referenced this cartridge a bunch of times already in the podcast, so now let's talk about it in more detail. Holland Holland introduced this cartridge back in 1912, and it is really the godfather of all belted magnums to this day. As a medium power, medium bore cartridge designed for use with smokeless propellants and intended for use in bolt-action rifles, like I mentioned earlier, the 375 H&H could be described as the British response to the German 9.3x62. This cartridge uses a very long, highly tapered case with a shallow shoulder and a belt. Now, if you don't know, a belt is basically what it sounds like. If you picture someone took a regular bottlenecked cartridge case and then just put another small belt of metal near the base, that is what it is. This belt was for head spacing. Now, most cartridges either headspace on the shoulder, like stuff like a 30-06, or off a rim at the base of the case, like the 9.3x74R, or sometimes via a case lip. Now, the 375 used such a highly tapered case with such a shallow shoulder angle that they decided that the best way to ensure positive head spacing with this cartridge was to put the belt on it and then have the cartridge head space off the belt. Now, this cartridge has a 62,000 psi SAAMI pressure, so pressure is at the high end of things. But I will say, though, the gun makers at Holland Holland specifically designed this cartridge with optimum reliability under hot conditions in mind. Now, cordite was the smokeless propellant that the British were using at the time, and that's what they designed the 375 H&H to use. You can use regular smokeless propellants in it now. But cordite is very temperature sensitive, and higher ambient temperatures will produce higher pressures with a given load. So at the time, the British had extensive colonial interests in Africa and India, where hot weather was very common. So for this reason, the designers at Holland Holland built the cartridge with a very gently tapering case to aid in chambering and extraction under difficult environmental conditions. For example, a cartridge with less taper and maybe a steeper shoulder angle, like one of the more modern design cartridges that's very popular today, if you load it with something like cordite and have it designed for optimum reliability in the United Kingdom, where it may be 40 or 50 degrees Fahrenheit, and then you bring it to Africa or India, where it may be well over 100 degrees Fahrenheit, it is very possible that you could experience a situation where you shoot it on a hunt in hot weather like that. It produces more pressure than the cartridge is designed to handle, and it gets stuck in the chamber when you're trying to extract it. If you're dealing with an angry tiger or Cape buffalo or elephant, that is something that could literally cost the hunter his life. So that is why the designers at Holland Holland put such an emphasis on reliability under those conditions when they designed this cartridge. And they were very successful in doing that. And as a matter of fact, even though modern smokeless propellants are much more temperature stable than cordite, and this is going to be less of an issue dealing with excess pressure in very hot weather like that, that gently tapering case of the 375 is still very useful today, and the cartridge still has a stellar reputation for reliable feeding and extraction in the field. When the chips are down and you need that next cartridge to smoothly chamber in order to stop a charging buffalo, it's really nice to have that tapered case that just effortlessly slithers into the chamber. But since the cartridge lacked both a sharp shoulder and a rim, the designers of the 375 H&H incorporated a revolutionary belt near the base of the cartridge to ensure correct head spacing. Now, in episode 286, I talked at length about the 30-06, and I compared all of the really popular 30 caliber cartridges to it. Well, everything in this episode is compared to the 375 H&H for a reason. It's just the granddaddy of them all. It's a very effective and elegant cartridge that has just flat out worked. My goodness, has this cartridge made its bones in Africa over the years as a solid all-around hunting cartridge for both plains game and dangerous game. I think this has to do with the fact that the 375 H&H is right in that sweet spot where it's powerful enough to cleanly kill all manner of game, but recoil isn't too bad either. In fact, 375 recoil, like I mentioned earlier, is right near the upper end of what that typical hunter can deal with. So you combine that really good overall performance with the moderate recoil of the cartridge, that can enhance shot placement, and then both of those things together enhance the overall reputation of the cartridge. Additionally, it shoots bullets, especially those heavier weight bullets, at somewhat sedate velocities that are conducive to good bullet performance, especially with what they had available in the early 20th century. You need really tough bullets for optimum performance with the really high velocity stuff. But an impact velocity at 23, 24, 2,500 feet per second isn't nearly as tough on a bullet as one going 2,700 feet per second or faster. So you take those old Kynoch round nose solids or basic soft point bullets that guys had back then, and they worked very well in that velocity range. I think this aspect of things should not be overlooked, and that is one of the things that really helped the cartridge develop such a sterling reputation over the years. Now, since it is so versatile, many hunters choose the 375 H&H when they want a quote-unquote one-gun safari. By simply changing the bullets used, a hunter can use the cartridge for just about any species of game in the world, regardless of whether that person is pursuing Cape buffalo or plains game in Africa, red stag in New Zealand or Europe, or even using it on the spectrum of game in North America. Here's what John Taylor had to say about the 375 H&H in his book, African Rifles and Cartridges. Its weight and diameter, combined with its speed and depth of penetration, would seem to be the factors that are responsible for its amazing killing power. And when I say amazing killing power, that's just what I mean. It's not mere hyperbole. Only those who have actually used this cartridge on a wide variety of different animals, having previously used quote-unquote ordinary rifles on those same species, are in a position to thoroughly appreciate the 375 Magnum's deadliness. So that's high praise indeed for a guy that hunted as much as John Taylor did with as many different cartridges as he did too. Now, bullet weights for this cartridge can go down to about 235 grains, shoot those bullets at 2,900 feet per second, maybe even 3,000 feet per second with hand loads, and you can go up to 350 or even a 380 grain bullet at 21 to 2,300 feet per second. Two classic loads for the 375 H&H are a 270 grain bullet at 2,700 feet per second for about 4,300 foot-pounds of energy, or a 300 grain bullet at around 2,550 feet per second for about 4,200 foot-pounds of energy. For instance, Hornady makes a 300 grain loading, actually two 300 grain loadings with the DGX bonded and DGS solid bullets at 2,530 feet per second. Those heavier 270 grain monolithic bullets, and especially the 300 grain lead core bullets, great for the really big stuff, and you can use them really on all manner of game. Black bear, kudu, eland, elk, grizzly brown bear, Cape buffalo, moose, all that stuff. Hornady makes an offering for the 375 H&H in their outfitter line with a 250 grain CX bullet at 2,700 feet per second for just over 4,000 foot-pounds of muzzle energy. That's a very tough monometal bullet that's going to penetrate really well and have just devastating effects on all manner of game. I would feel perfectly comfortable using that ammunition for any species of game in the world smaller than Cape buffalo. Some outfitters in Alaska have a 375 minimum caliber requirement for the big bears. The 375 H&H works great in that role. In fact, the 375 H&H is not only incredibly effective on the really big grizzly and brown bears, but it is also very, very popular for that use too, due in part to the requirement that some outfitters have to use that cartridge. But I will tell you this, Boone & Crockett has a search function in their record book where you can look up what the most popular methods of take were, drilled down to even the specific bow weight and rifle cartridge that was used for all the entries in the record book. And the 375 H&H is far and away the most popular cartridge used to take Alaskan brown bears that are in the Boone & Crockett record book today. So take that for what you will. I killed an American bison with mine with a 300 grain Barnes TSX bullet. Amazing performance. I got great penetration combined with lots of impact authority when I shot that bison. Now, the super heavy 350 or even 380 grain bullets are known for especially impressive penetration, and they are good choices for backing or raking shots on really, really large game, especially elephant. Now, the 375 H&H also has a surprisingly flat trajectory, and it's, like I said, surprisingly suitable for shots out to 400 yards or so, and perhaps even a little farther in the right hands. Chris Dorsey actually came on the show, episode 105, and he talked about hunting bongo and mountain inyala in Africa. He almost exclusively uses a 375 H&H for all of his Africa hunts, to include those two particular animals. Now, not only is the 375 H&H the standard by which others are judged, it is also used as the basis for other newer and more modern cartridges, like all of the Winchester Magnums, the 7mm Remington Magnum, most of the Weatherby cartridges, etc. Now, Holland Holland also designed another cartridge at the same time that they called the 375 Flanged Magnum. This is almost a rimmed sister cartridge to the 375 H&H Magnum. And this cartridge was designed specifically for use in double rifles, whereas the regular 375 H&H Magnum was used in bolt-action rifles. In this case, it uses not only a rimmed case, but the case itself is longer. It's also loaded to a little bit lower pressure, 47,000 psi versus 62,000 psi for the regular 375. All things considered, the 375 Flanged is a little bit slower. Shoot a 300 grain bullet at about 2,400 feet per second instead of just over 2,500 feet per second. Now, interestingly, that may actually put this cartridge almost perfectly in that sweet spot where recoil is further reduced a little bit and velocity is almost perfect with it. Now, Kevin Robertson actually also talked about in his book, Africa's Most Dangerous, about some experiences he had with a bolt-action rifle in 375 H&H that he used as a client rifle. Weighing in at about 9 pounds, he thought the rifle was a little bit too light, and this was negatively affecting recoil, making it too painful for his clients to shoot. So he took some hand loads, downloaded them a little bit from about 2,550 feet per second muzzle velocity with a 300 grain bullet down to 2,350 to 2,400 feet per second. He noticed that recoil noticeably improved, and mysteriously, killing power of the rifle improved as well, and buffalo that might have taken more than one shot to bring down were more likely to require just a single shot with that rifle after he lowered the velocity a little bit. Now, a large part of that can certainly be attributed to reduced recoil, improving people's shooting ability, and thus improving their shot placement on the buffalo too. And so even if actually changing the velocity itself didn't necessarily improve the killing power of the rifle, it certainly didn't hurt it, at least not enough to offset the improved shot placement that was accompanying that reduced recoil and reduced muzzle velocity. So that's a long way of saying that he had excellent results with some 375 H&H hand loads that were basically duplicating the performance of the old 375 flanged cartridge. Now, as a rimmed cartridge, the 375 flange was designed for use in break-action rifles, specifically double rifles. Now, interestingly, the 375 H&H Magnum as a belted cartridge actually lends itself pretty well to use in both a double rifle and a bolt-action rifle. So you can still find rifles in that chambering out there in 375 flanged, but they're also not very common. But for instance, Heim makes their 88B and 89B double rifles in both 375 H&H Magnum and 375 flanged. I think all things considered, the 375 H&H Magnum is definitely the much more popular of these two cartridges. Bergara, Browning makes their X-Bolt in it. Christensen Arms makes some rifles in it. Kimber, Nosler. Remington at least used to make rifles in 375 H&H. I'm not sure if they still do with their Model 700. Weatherby makes some. All of those companies make rifles in 375 H&H Magnum. Winchester also makes their Model 70 Alaskan and African versions in 375 H&H Magnum too. That is the only company I'm aware of that at least mass produces rifles in that chambering with controlled round feed. CZ used to make their 550 in that configuration. They don't anymore. Same thing with the FN Brownings and the Ruger Safari Magnums. They made a lot of all those rifles, though, and many of them weren't shot very much. So if you look hard enough, you can find one of those rifles in 375 H&H on the used market if you want. In fact, Winchester also made left-handed Model 70s in 375-2 with that controlled feed action. I wouldn't say they're common, but they're definitely out there, and you can find them if you look hard enough. So all in all, 375 H&H, very popular, very effective cartridge. You got a lot of options for ammunition with it, with Federal, with Hornady, Barnes, Swift. Remington even makes some ammo for it as well, the 270 grain bullet. Of course, most of the European manufacturers make ammo for it as well. I would not say that any of this stuff is quote-unquote cheap or quote-unquote common compared to something, once again, like a 308 or a 30-06. But as far as stuff in this power range, a big bore cartridge that's capable on thick-skin dangerous game, this is about as good as it gets as far as variety and availability of both rifles and ammunition. Hands down, the most popular of everything we're going to talk about in this episode. All right, now we'll talk about a very similar but newer cartridge, the 375 Ruger. Ruger built this cartridge in partnership with Hornady, right? We haven't heard that before, right? Hornady and Ruger working together on something. But they built the 375 Ruger to deliver 375 H&H performance out of a rifle with a standard length action, same as the 30-06. As I've talked about at length in the past, there's a long-standing desire to use cartridges that can fit in a standard length action rifle. And as I have referenced previously, the 375 H&H Magnum is a long cartridge, 3.6 inches long overall, requires the length of a quote-unquote Magnum length action rifle, whereas the 30-06 is only 3.34 inches long and can fit in a much shorter action rifle. Now, at the time, say in the 1980s, 1990s, early 2000s, Ruger produced their Safari Magnum line of rifles in 375 H&H, 416 Rigby, and 458 Winchester Magnum. Those were great rifles, but they were also expensive, relatively expensive anyway, and the folks at Ruger wanted a new cartridge they could use in their M77 Hawkeye rifles. Those rifles cost about half as much to make as the Safari Magnum rifles. So they officially released the 375 Ruger in 2007. This is a unique cartridge with no parent case, but it's basically a shorter and fatter case with very little taper compared to the much more highly tapered 375 H&H. Now, the 375 Ruger is a beltless case, and the actual body of the case is 0.532 inches in diameter. That is the same size as the belted portion of the 375 H&H case, but it is larger than the 0.512-inch body diameter of the 375 H&H at the base. So even though it is shorter overall, the 375 Ruger actually has about 4 to 5% more case capacity than the 375 H&H because it is less tapered and has a fatter case. Now, the folks at Hornady could get away with using such a radically different case design with the 375 Ruger compared to the 375 H&H because modern propellants are much more temperature stable than cordite, and so the issues with a pressure spike in hot weather like they were afraid of with cordite, much less of an issue now. So they could build a case that is more optimized for performance in order to get that extra performance without really sacrificing reliability. So the end result is that the 375 Ruger can equal 375 H&H ballistics out of a shorter barrel, like a Ruger guide gun with a 20-inch barrel, and it can very slightly exceed the 375 H&H when both are shot out of the same length barrel. For instance, Hornady advertises factory loads for the 375 Ruger and 375 H&H, both from a 24-inch barrel, both 300-grain bullet. The H&H can push that bullet 2,530 feet per second. The Ruger can shoot that same bullet 2,660 feet per second, so 130 feet per second faster. Ruger currently offers this rifle in their Hawkeye African, Alaskan, and guide gun models. Same with their FTW Hunter rifle. Now, the guide gun and the Hawkeye African are also both available in left-handed models, too, in 375 Ruger. I really like that guide gun, and there's literally nothing else out there where you can get that level of performance out of a compact rifle with a 20-inch barrel that also has a Mauser-style controlled feed action. That rifle also has a threaded barrel, and it is a great option for someone who wants to suppress a dangerous game rifle too. I would not recommend throwing a suppressor on a 375 H&H with a 24-inch barrel or something like that, but put it on a 20-inch barrel and it's a whole different ballgame. Mossberg offers their Patriot rifle in this chambering too. Same with the Savage 110 Bear Hunter and Brush Hunter. Gunworks even makes their Skull rifle on 375 Ruger as well. I'll say there's not a ton of variety in 375 Ruger, but there are a lot of those guns out there, and they are not hard to find either new or on the used market. They're also not expensive rifles either, and they're considerably less expensive than typical 375 H&H rifles. Especially for Americans, the 375 Ruger may be the cartridge to go with if you want a new production, reasonably priced, yet still capable, dangerous game rifle. Now, I think the Hawkeye African is a great rifle, but like I said, I really like that guide gun here for everything from plains game you'd hunt on an African safari, also buffalo, another dangerous game, hippo, etc., to hunting big bears up in Alaska, to even game like deer, elk, black bear, moose, elsewhere. Heck, this would also be a great rifle cartridge combination for something like Nogai, where you're dealing with a pretty big but also pretty tough animal in thick country down in South Texas. All right, do you remember what I said a few minutes ago about the 375 H&H accounting for more brown bears in the Boone and Crockett record book than any other cartridge? For what it's worth, the 338 Win Mag is number 2, and the much newer 375 Ruger is number 3. Remember, that cartridge came along nearly a century after the 375 H&H and over 50 years after the 338 Win Mag, yet it is still seeing a lot of use, not only in Africa, but all over North America as well, especially on those big bears. As I record this, Hornady and Swift are the only companies I'm aware of that make 375 Ruger factory ammo. Supplies are pretty good, though. Not quite as much variety as the 375 H&H, but availability is really good. Hornady makes a 250 grain outfitter load with their CX bullet. They also make a 270 grain load with the interlock. They also make 300 grain loadings with the DGX bonded and DGS solid bullet. Swift makes loads with their 300 grain A-frame and breakaway solid. And of course, you can hand load basically any 375 caliber bullet that you would use in, say, the 375 H&H in the 375 Ruger too. And interestingly, this cartridge can be surprisingly effective at extended range. With the 270 grain Barnes LRX hand loaded to go at just over 2,800 feet per second, you get a real thumper that is capable at a much longer distance than you might initially think. With a 200 yard zero, you get just under 8 inches of drop at 300 yards and still darn near 3,000 foot-pounds of energy at that range. That is comparable to a 30-06 trajectory, but it has about 50% more retained energy at 300 yards. And in fact, it has about as much retained energy at 300 yards as the 30-06 does at the muzzle. And like I mentioned earlier, Gunworks does make the 375 Ruger in their Skull rifle. So this is a really good all-around cartridge for basically all the same stuff that you would use the 375 H&H for. You can use it for the smaller game with lighter bullets or for the heavier bullets too. But man, a 250 grain Barnes or CX or something like that, a great all-around cartridge for use in North America. You can, and same thing on plains game in Africa too. You can bump up to the heavier bullets, take it to Africa, plains game, buffalo, use those heavier bullets if you wanted a one gun, one ammo safari to use on plains game and buffalo or elephant or hippo or whatever. The cartridge got a little bit of a bad name very early on with the old 300 grain DGX bullets on really thick skin game like buffalo. Remember, those are the old not bonded bullets though. Switching over to the DGX bonded bullets fixed all those problems and everything works a whole lot better now. The outfitter I work with in Africa actually has a client rifle, Ruger guide gun in 375 Ruger. They've had it since, 2015, 2016, something like that. Since then, they have put over 3,000 rounds through that rifle. We've had a couple of clients who loved using it in Africa so much that they went home and bought one of their own. Wonderful setup for use on plains game, wonderful on buffalo too. And like I mentioned earlier, that rifle only has a 20-inch barrel and it's threaded, so we have a suppressor on it. So it hits like a hammer, but it's not that loud and it doesn't recoil that much either. Wonderful combination, very, very effective all around. Now, even though the 375 Ruger is a fairly new cartridge itself, it has also already served as a parent case to a good number of other cartridges, like the 300 and the 338 Ruger Compact Magnum, the 416 Ruger, which is basically a 375 Ruger necked up to a 416 caliber. It's going to give you very close to 416 RUM mag or 416 Rigby performance out of that standard linked action rifle, and it's also the parent to all of the precision rifle cartridges. So all around, great rifle cartridge. I really like the 375 Ruger. That's no shade at all at the 375 H&H or the 9.3 by 62, but man, this is a really excellent, high-performing, very capable cartridge. It's a wonderful deal when you can get 375 H&H performance out of a standard linked rifle and out of a 20-inch barrel like that. There's nothing else that can do that. And I would prefer to get that level of performance in a smaller package than more performance out of a bigger package. All right. Speaking of more performance out of a bigger package, we have the 375 Weatherby and the 375 Ackley Improved. These are both very similar cartridges. Not the same, but similar. Now, the 375 Ackley Improved uses a 375 H&H case, but like P.O. Ackley did with basically all of the other cartridges he improved, his signature move was to remove a lot of the body taper in the case and then give it a steep 40-degree shoulder. Roy Weatherby followed a similar formula. He also removed the taper from the 375 H&H case, but instead of giving it a 40-degree shoulder, he added Weatherby's signature double radius shoulder and gave it a little bit extra freebore. Both cartridges give you very, very similar levels of performance. They can fire a 300-grain bullet at around 2,800 feet per second. Sometimes a little slower, sometimes a little faster. It depends on the rifle, though. That gives you about 5,200 foot-pounds of energy. It's about 200 to 300 feet per second faster than the regular 375 H&H. Now, the interesting thing about both of these cartridges is that since they use just a slightly modified 375 H&H case, you can use regular 375 H&H ammunition in them if you want to. The ballistics are a little bit reduced, comparable to what you'd get out of the regular 375 H&H, but it's an option. Now, the Ackley cartridge was never mass-produced. The 375 Weatherby was. They made it from 1944 to 1960. Production ceased then when Weatherby switched their focus to the 378 Weatherby instead. We'll talk more about that cartridge here in a second. But Weatherby did eventually bring back the 375 Weatherby in 2001. Neither one of these cartridges was a gigantic success. Yes, they are improvements over the 375 H&H, but not gigantic improvements. Yeah, they have more energy. Yeah, they are flatter shooting. But for many people, the juice wasn't worth the squeeze. In both cases, you have a cartridge that's really, quote-unquote, running up the score with those really fast muzzle velocities. And that's a way to get a very dramatic improvement in your muzzle energy, because muzzle energy is calculated by using velocity squared. So a small change in muzzle velocity results in a much bigger change in muzzle energy. But we can sit around and debate for hours how much a change in muzzle energy results in actual improved killing power on game. Now, I can definitely see how it is possibly a better killer than the 375 H&H. I'm talking about both the Weatherby and the Ackley here, especially on light and medium game. But like I said, though, I'm not sure the juice is worth the squeeze in terms of recoil and muzzle blast on dangerous game. With identical shot placement, sure, I can see an improvement in killing power if the right bullets are used and if they're put in the right place. But shot placement is more complicated, though, with these cartridges. Like I talked about earlier, yes, some people can handle it, no problem. But just a regular 375 H&H, is, like I said, man, it's right there with what a lot of people can deal with, right at the maximum end of it. You check that recoil up a little bit like you get with these cartridges, shot placement gets more difficult. Additionally, that added velocity results in more retained energy at longer range and a little bit flatter trajectory. And so it's very easy to see how the 375 Weatherby and Ackley would be better at longer range than the 375 H&H. But the problem is that, especially in Africa, most hunts where you'd really need a 375 in the first place are, by their very nature, usually shorter ranged engagements. Shots past 100 yards are very rare on thick-skinned, dangerous game, and those past 200 yards are even rarer still. So for this reason, cartridges with a very flat trajectory and lots of retained energy at extended range are of limited utility in Africa on a dangerous game hunt. In many cases, these hunts are conducted in areas where the terrain is pretty thick and you can't see that far anyway, and so it really wouldn't even be possible to take a 300-yard shot oftentimes. Not all the time, but oftentimes. And at the same time, professional hunters tend to be very diligent about getting their hunters as close as possible to the animal before they shoot to further improve shot placement. So, no matter how good you are, we're all going to shoot a smaller group at 50 yards than we do at 150 yards. That's always important. It's even more important when you're shooting something that can kill you. Things are different when pursuing other game, though, right? Shots on some plains game can be longer. And the same is true for hunting animals elsewhere in the world, right? If you wanted to use your 375 to hunt elk or brown bear in some parts of Alaska or elsewhere in North America, you might get a much longer shot than you would on a Cape buffalo in Africa. So in those cases, that extra velocity can indeed be more useful, and one could make the argument that while the 375 H&H is very good in many of those other situations, the 375 Weatherby or the 375 Ackley Improved could well be better. And the same is also true with the 375 RUM and the 378 Weatherby, and we're going to talk about both of those in a minute. Now, the thing with these cartridges, all of them, but I'm talking about the 375 Ackley and Weatherby here, is you need premium bullets, though. Remember what I was talking about earlier with the 375 H&H and how it did really well with those very basic round nose and soft point bullets. It does better with premium bullets, but it was acceptable with those more primitive bullets. Well, with these much higher velocity cartridges, where you're going to get probably a much higher impact velocity, you need a much tougher bullet to stand up to that stress. So the Barnes bullets are great, Swift A-frame, nozzle partition, that sort of thing. And because these two cartridges utilize an improved 375 H&H case, where you're just burning more powder in them, that's how they get that extra performance, is they make the case physically a little bit bigger and put more powder in it. They need a little bit longer barrel, too. So instead of maybe a 24-inch barrel like you'd be using with a 375 H&H Magnum, well, maybe a 25, 26-inch barrel is more appropriate for these. And additionally, for both of these two cartridges, there's not a lot of ammo availability. Yeah, Weatherby still makes 375 Weatherby ammo, but they don't make a lot of it, and it is one of their lesser popular Weatherby cartridges. And like I said, the Ackley was never mass-produced, so that cartridge is a handloader's proposition, and really, for the most part, so is the 375 Weatherby, unless you're just always on the lookout for that ammo and stockpiling it whenever you can find it. So those are the downsides. Harder to find and usually more expensive ammo, more recoil, more muzzle blast, usually need a longer barrel to get that optimum performance out of it. Take those things on the negative side in exchange for a couple hundred feet per second more velocity. You get the flatter trajectory, more energy, really at all ranges. Is the juice worth the squeeze? I think no. Not everybody agrees with me, though, and I respect that. For me, if I'm going to deal with all of those downsides I just mentioned, I think I would prefer to just make the jump up to something larger in diameter, like a 404 Jeffrey, 416 Rigby, etc. Well, like I said, that's just me. No problem if you want to use one of those cartridges, just be aware of what the problems are associated with them. In that same vein, let's talk about the 375 Remington Ultra Magnum. This is basically a 300 RUM, which is itself a modified 404 Jeffrey case, necked up to shoot 375 caliber bullets. Same design principle as the 7 RUM and the 338 RUM as well. This is a beltless cartridge, has a rebaited rim, full-length Magnum, also loaded to a very high pressure, 65,000 psi. Since it has a larger diameter case than the 375 H&H, it has more powder capacity than the 375 H&H. You combine that with its additional pressure, and you get more velocity with the same weight bullet. For reference, you're going to shoot 90 to 100 grains of powder in many 375 RUM loads versus 70 to 80-ish for the 375 H&H. Shoot the same weight bullet 200 to 300 feet per second faster than the 375 H&H. In the same ballpark as the 375 Weatherby and 375 Ackley, maybe a little bit faster. There are currently 2 factory loads available for this cartridge that I'm aware of. Remington makes a 270 grain soft point loading at 2,900 feet per second for just over 5,000 foot-pounds of energy. Barnes actually makes 375 RUM ammo in their Vortex long range line with a 270 grain LRX bullet at 2,980 feet per second for about 5,300 foot-pounds of energy. Remington used to make a loading with a 300 grain Swift A-frame at about 2,760 feet per second for, once again, just over 5,000 foot-pounds of energy. So like I said, same weight bullet, a couple hundred feet per second faster than the 375 H&H. And actually, that old loading with the 300 grain Swift A-frame is shooting a 300 grain bullet about as fast, a little bit faster than the 375 H&H is shooting a 270 grain bullet. Now, once again, this is a very high velocity cartridge. Premium bullets are a must with this cartridge. The Barnes is fine, so is that Swift A-frame. Not sure about that 270 grain Remington soft point though. That could very well be a recipe for bullet failure. You stand up a big elk or moose or buffalo with that bullet at real close range, try and shoot it through the shoulder blade on a strongly quartering shot or something like that. You might have that bullet fail to penetrate and reach the vitals, and that's not something anybody wants. Now, like I mentioned in my 30 caliber podcast, episode 286, the 300 RUM is a boomer round. Now, the same is true with the 375 RUM and really the 7 and 338 RUMs as well. Do not mean that as a slur, but I'm just saying this is a cartridge that was used extensively by people in that generation. Let's think about it this way. Got a guy born in 1950. He would have been 50 in the year 2000 when the 375 RUM hit the market. That is an age where a lot of people are at a point with their career and their family where they can go on an exotic hunt somewhere that they've dreamed about for a long time. Go to Africa, go to Alaska, whatever. Well, Remington rolls out this new line of really awesome looking cartridges that seem perfect for that sort of hunting. Ah, man, I'll go shoot an elk out west, or I'm going to go to Alaska, shoot this bear. I'm going to go to Africa, go hunt plains game and Cape buffalo. Man, these cartridges look great. Eye-popping ballistics. I can get 5,000 foot-pounds of energy from a 375 RUM. I can also get it in a reasonably priced Remington Model 700 rifle. Lots and lots of guys use that combination on hunts all over the world. Now, despite some of the downsides of the cartridge, it worked really well for a lot of things. A lot of people killed a lot of game all over the world with the various RUM cartridges, to include the 375 RUM. Once again, this is a very flat-shooting cartridge, very hard-hitting cartridge. You put a well-constructed bullet from 375 RUM in the right place, it will upend darn near any animal on this planet. That's the plus side of things. The unfortunate downside of the cartridge is like the 375 Weatherby and 375 Ackley, got lots of recoil, lots of muzzle blast with it. The 375 RUM delivers those ballistic advantages over the 375 H&H at the expense of about 35% more free recoil energy. Now, since the 375 H&H is a stout recoiling cartridge itself, you take that and you add 35% of a big number to an already big number, and you get an even bigger number. So it's hard to overstate what the deal is with that recoil. That additional powder charge, remember, you're dealing with approaching 100 grains of powder in a 375 RUM. That means you need a longer barrel to efficiently and effectively burn all of that powder. Once again, looking at about 26-inch long barrels here. Some were 24, a lot of them were 26 though. Now, some of those barrels even had a muzzle brake on the end of them. And my goodness, I cannot imagine what it would be like to be on the wrong end of a 375 RUM with a muzzle brake on it. That is terrible for your hearing, and it is especially terrible for those around you, like your guide or your tracker. Make darn sure you wear ear protection if you have a 375 RUM, especially if it has a brake. All things considered, everything I said about the 375 Weatherby and the 375 Ackley applies here, both in terms of good things and bad things. This is an interesting area, and this may be actually why the 300 and 338 RUM, in particular, of all the Remington Ultra Magnum cartridges, are the ones in that line that seem to have been the most popular. That is because, at least in my opinion, they offer, on balance, more benefits than downsides to more hunters in the situations they are best suited for. Because remember, just like I talked about earlier, you're not going to shoot a Cape buffalo at 250 yards. So having great performance with a 375 RUM on a buffalo at that range, doesn't really matter, but you still have all the downsides associated with it. But you might shoot your elk at 250 or 350 or 450 yards. And in that case, maybe the 300 RUM, yeah, it's got some of the same downsides as the 375 RUM. They're not as big, though, in terms of recoil and whatnot. But this is an area where that advantage, say a 300 RUM has over something similar, like, I don't know, a 300 Win Mag, under those conditions actually pays more dividends and makes the downsides of using that cartridge more worthwhile. But the 375 RUM is a bigger jump up over the 300 and the 338 RUM, and you don't necessarily need that cartridge for hunting elk or moose or something like that. Those smaller cartridges will work fine for that. Though it does have, say, the same advantages of maybe the 375 Weatherby up on brown bear in Alaska or something along those lines. So once again, I don't think the juice is worth the squeeze here, but not everyone agrees with me. For instance, Corey Knowlton is a noted advocate of the 375 RUM. All things considered, the 375 RUM delivers really good performance at longer range than the 375 H&H. You might not need it in Africa, but other places that's more useful. Now, if you look at the figures, you're getting around 458 Win Mag muzzle energy. The 375 RUM also has more momentum and a higher Taylor knockout factor than the 375 H&H. Some swear the cartridge is more effective than the 375 H&H on thick-skin dangerous game for those reasons and produces more visible reactions on dangerous game than the old 375. Now, as we wrap up with the 375 RUM, here's two final pieces of data. One, you just got those two factory loads I mentioned, one from Barnes, one from Remington. Otherwise, you got a hand load for the cartridge. I'm not aware of any new production rifles in 375 RUM either. They made a bunch of Remington 700 rifles in that chambering, and so I'm sure you can find a used one on the market if there's no new ones in production right now. Now, additionally, it was primarily available in the old Remington 700 rifle. That rifle is a push feed rifle, does not have that Mauser claw extractor or the controlled round feeding. I've heard more than one story of a hunter in Africa with a Remington 700 on a hot weather hunt that had reliability issues with their rifle, especially when it comes to extraction issues with a spent case getting stuck in the chamber. So keep that in mind too. Next up, we have the 378 Weatherby. This one came out in 1953. This cartridge does not have a parent case, but it is a belted Magnum along the lines of the 375 H&H, but it uses a larger diameter case similar to the 416 Rigby. So the overall case size is just gigantic. Federal actually had to develop the 215 Magnum primer specifically for this cartridge. Modern Weatherby factory loads claim a 300-grain bullet at around 29-25 feet per second for nearly 5,700 foot-pounds of energy. Just like I keep saying with these last couple cartridges, everything about the 375 H&H here, just more of it. Same pros and cons with the 378 Weatherby as you would get with the 375 Weatherby, the 375 Ackley, the 375 RUM. Lots of recoil, lots of muzzle blast, limited ammo options. Ammo is expensive, needs a long barrel. 26 inches is common. I know Weatherby makes some that are 28 inches long, have a 26-inch barrel with a 2-inch long muzzle brake at the end of it. Remember, those brakes are terrible for your hearing and those around you. That is a way to just beat the heck out of your guide and your tracker on a hunt if you bring a big Weatherby Magnum like that with a muzzle brake on it. Wear ear protection while you're shooting and while you're hunting if you have one of these rifles with a brake on it. So those are the downsides of the cartridge, but once again, this is a very flat shooting, very hard hitting cartridge, carries a lot of energy out to extended range, very capable, very impressive killer on all manner of game. Same deal I talked about earlier with bullets. You need tough bullets here. You try and put a really soft bullet in a 378 Weatherby, recipe for bullet failure on a close range shot. Now, the other downside that you might get sometimes with these really high velocity cartridges is you might get excessive penetration with a premium quality bullet. And I have heard stories of guys shooting these real fast 375s, putting a really good bullet in them, and having shots exit that they did not expect to exit. You should always be very, very careful with what is behind your target when you're shooting at it. But say, for instance, with the Cape buffalo, they are a herd animal, and they are commonly found in the company of other animals. They are also commonly hunted in thick brush where it is hard to see what is behind the animal. So sometimes, despite your best efforts, there may be another buffalo behind the one that you're shooting at that, even after you looked really closely, you didn't realize was there. So it is possible that you could have a shot, hit your buffalo, exit it, and then continue on and strike another animal behind it. And now you are in a very, very dangerous situation where you got two buffalo that are hit. Hopefully this first one that you made a good shot on is going to run a short distance and die, but that other animal might not be hit very well, might be wounded, very upset. Now everyone's attention is going to be focused on that first buffalo, the one you're intending to shoot. Everyone's going to be watching it to see what it does, where it goes. That means that that other buffalo that you might have wounded, no one is paying attention to it, and that could come out of nowhere and attack somebody when you're following up that other buffalo. This is actually one of the most dangerous situations you can be in on a hunt in Africa, where you have a wounded buffalo like that nobody knows is wounded. And more than one hunter has been killed in this exact situation over the years. So yes, this is a situation where you can have too much of a good thing. And like I said, yeah, do everything you can to make sure there's no animal behind the one that you're shooting. Like I said, sometimes there's one there and you honestly don't know it's there. Do not underestimate this downside of these really powerful 375 cartridges. Now, the upside of the 378 Weatherby compared to the 375 Weatherby is this cartridge is much more popular in the Weatherby line of cartridges. They, of course, still produce ammo for both of them. They make more 378 Weatherby ammo. It is more readily available than the others. Just as a side note, too, Roy Weatherby used the 378 Weatherby as the parent cartridge for both the 460 Weatherby, necked up in that case, and the 378 Weatherby, necked down in that case. So you have one of the most powerful cartridges in the world, hunting cartridges in the world, with the 460 Weatherby, and the fastest 30 caliber cartridge in the world with the 378 Weatherby, both of which are based on the 378 Weatherby. And one last thing with availability before we move on. Weatherby does currently make rifles and ammunition for this cartridge, and it is much more popular on both counts than the 375 Weatherby. I don't think any other company does make or has made ammo or rifles for the 378 Weatherby. But as long as Weatherby's in business, they are going to continue to support it. All right, next, let's talk about another cartridge you may not have heard of. It's the 375 Swiss P, also known as the 9.5 by 70 millimeter cartridge. Released in 2018, this is the newest and nearly the most powerful cartridge on this list. This is not a hunting cartridge, but this is a military sniping round designed to fill the gap between the 338 Lapua and the 50 BMG. This is a rebated rim cartridge. It's basically a 338 Lapua Magnum scaled up to use a case diameter that is the same as the 500 Jeffrey. So basically, it is designed to facilitate rebarreling a 338 Lapua rifle to the 375 Swiss cartridge. The end result is we have a cartridge here that can fire a very high BC, 350 grain bullet at just over 2,800 feet per second for a whopping 6,200 foot-pounds of kinetic energy. The manufacturer advertises a G1 BC of .801 for their 350 grain projectile. They claim it remains supersonic out past 1,600 meters, out to about a mile, and it can penetrate level 4 body armor out past 600 meters. So this is a big step up in power over the 338 Lapua, which is quite a cartridge in and of itself, but it comes in a significantly smaller and lighter package than the 50 BMG. But remember, let's not get carried away here. This is a very big, very heavy rifle. This is a precision shooting setup, not something you're going to really lug around the woods on a hunt. I don't think anybody even makes any ammo suited for hunting for this cartridge anyway. In that same vein, we have the 375 CheyTac. Came out in 2017, also known as the 9.5 by 77 millimeter. If you played Call of Duty, you're probably familiar with the Intervention Sniper Rifle. That is a real rifle originally chambered in the .408 CheyTac cartridge. Well, the 375 CheyTac is a necked down version of that cartridge built to fill the same general niche as the 375 Swiss. Now, the 408 CheyTac is itself a modified 400 Taylor Magnum, which is itself a modified and necked down 505 Gibbs. So once again, we got a real fat cartridge here. This one shoots a 350 grain bullet at 2,970 feet per second for about 6,800 foot-pounds of energy. Once again, ridiculously high BC bullet. G1 BC advertised a .988. They claim it remains supersonic past 2,200 meters and that it carries over 4,000 foot-pounds of energy out past 800 yards. There was a guy at the FTW Ranch with a Hill Country rifle in 375 CheyTac that made a little bit of waves in the shooting community for making 4 hits on a target at just over 4,500 yards. And once again, just like the 375 Swiss, this is a very big, very heavy rifle. Precision shooting setup, not something you're going to lug around the woods on a hunt. Once again, about 30-pound plus rifle. So great for bang and steel at really, really long range, but no one's going to be hunting with this thing. I only mentioned the 375 Swiss and the 375 CheyTac because they are a continuation of what I briefly mentioned with the 375 H&H and the 375 Ruger and the bigger Magnums too, about how they actually perform surprisingly well at extended range. Sometimes you need that sort of performance, sometimes you don't. But in the precision shooting world or the military sniping community, there are benefits to that level of performance that you really don't necessarily appreciate in most hunting situations.
If you enjoyed this video, please make sure you subscribe to my YouTube channel right now and hit that like button. Just click on the thumbs up button and the red subscribe button below the video to make sure you don't miss out on any of my new videos about hunting gear reviews, cartridge comparisons, and more. Now, like I mentioned earlier, I've also put links below the video to articles I've written about some of these cartridges, as well as some of my favorite pieces of hunting gear, like slings, ear protection, scopes, things like that. Now, for more detailed information on popular hunting cartridges and what they are best suited for, click the link in the video description below or go to huntingguns101.com to get a free ebook I have written on the best hunting cartridges. Now I'm going to turn it over to you. Have you hunted with any of these 9.3mm or 375 caliber cartridges? If so, which one? What game have you successfully taken with them, and what rifle and ammo did you use in each case? Let me know by leaving a comment on this video right now. Also, feel free to leave a comment with requests for other cartridge comparisons or profiles you would like to see in the future. Thanks for watching, have a great day, and good hunting.